Yeah. Maybe I'll just close it. We'll save it.
Sounds good. Okay. First things first. All CapKs are not created equal. What are the different types of CapKs that you think?
Historical materialism.
Yep, that's one. It's usually called orthodox Marxism. What is that? What is historical materialism?
I think it's like review or rewrite history in the terms of class struggle.
Yep. Is an historical investigation or analysis of historical events through the lens or the paradigm of class antagonism. What is an antagonism? Come on, you should know this when talking about anti-blackness. What is an antagonism?
It's like a pessimistic view of something that's the other.
That's sort of it. You're a little too abstract there. I'm looking for something a little more concrete.
It's like a structural condition that places two things in opposition to each other.
Exactly. Structural condition that places two things in diametric opposition to one another. Which means that the two things are the antithesis of each other. They cannot exist. One is a negation of the other. What is an example of a class antagonism for Marx? Real simple.
Proletariat and the bourgeois.
Exactly. That is the only antagonism that should matter when talking about political or social phenomena, is how we can explain those things through the lens of that antagonism. What are some other things? What are some other forms of the CapK you'll see in debates?
Leninism, party-based politics.
Party-based politics or movemental politics, that's what I like to call it. Movemental capitalism. Usually abdicates either like traditional Communist Party politics or grassroots movements. It usually adopts some type of prior historical method that was used in those movements, like Leninism, or communist revolutions that existed in like South America, like the Zapatistas. It usually uses historical examples from a particular grassroots movement and claims that the 1AC's rejection is in solidarity or furthering of that method. What are some other ones? You're doing good so far. There, I had 7. I got 7 when I was looking at this. Yes, there's a bunch. And the funny thing is, I think I've run all of them in debates, which I thought was funny.
Globalization from below? I mean, that's one neoliberal, right?
Well, actually, that's one of them. That is one that is both the CapK and not the CapK. I put that on my list because just to explain why it is not the CapK, because people claim it is. Why do you think that is? What is the difference between a critique of neoliberalism and a critique of capitalism?
Capitalism focuses on just like the one singular country, while neoliberalism is like the global market.
Nope.
Capitalism is concerned about things like virtues and only the one antagonism, and neoliberalism is about the way democracy and capitalism are interconnected.
That's half the answer. I'm looking for something a little bit more simpler and fundamental to both the theories.
Neoliberalism focuses on both the state and the market instead of just the market.
It's much simpler than that. Yeah.
Neoliberalism also talks about like the knowledge economy versus just like the actual like economics.
Both other forms of Marxism talk about that too. Yep.
Neoliberalism is like capitalism on drugs.
No. I kind of gave you a hint to the answer when I said it's not really the CapK. What is that distinction that I alluded to?
Is it like regulation versus entire regulation?
You all are so close. Basically, the difference between neoliberalism and traditional critiques of capitalism is that neoliberalism does not agree that all market-based systems are bad. Neoliberalism just says certain forms of exaggerated forms of capitalism, like laissez-faire capitalism, are problematic. Like people, have you ever heard of the author Giroux? He's a big neoliberal scholar. People read him on topics. Giroux doesn't disagree with like the whole concept of capital exchange. He thinks markets are good. Capital can be used in just ways. It's just that the way the state and democracy interact with capitalism, which is part of the right answer, is problematic. But people, a lot of times when people hear neoliberalism Ks, they're like, oh, it's just Cap K. And then pull the 2AC, block the cap. But all of your impact turns to capitalism generically are not responsive to this version of the critique. So you need to be aware that when you're formulating your responses to capitalism that you're talking about the right form of capitalism, because your generic impact turns, a lot of times when I used to run neoliberalism and the 2AC would stand up and read like 8 minutes of cap good, I'm just like, sure, cap is good. And we're reading cards about why neoliberalism is a bad form of capitalism and that non-neoliberal systems are good forms of capitalism. So thank you for reading advantages to my alternative. Non-responsive. What are some other forms of the cap K? We're missing some big ones here. Like I have two ones on here that are probably a little bit smaller, but there is one in particular that I think we're missing that's really big.
Just like critical pedagogy.
Nope.
Semio-capitalism.
That's one of them. That is one of them. That was one of the smaller ones. What do you think the difference between semio-capitalism is and something like orthodox Marxism?
It's focused more on the sign economy, the other stuff is political economy.
Yeah, that's actually a very good way of articulating it. It also, there's a distinction usually in the method. Because they use like a more semiotic approach, something that's based on linguistics and representation, we're not looking for a lot of materialist strategies. Usually looking for like passivity. Like Baudrillard is a big scholar that talks about semio-capitalism. He talks about radical passivity as a means of antagonizing the system and letting it collapse, which I'm going to get to later when we talk about crisis theory, which is a very interesting. But yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on that. But yes, that's a different form of capitalism. What else? There's another one that's big. It's an author that you had to have heard in debates. You do policy debate, you've heard this author read in debates. That's a hint. No one's ever read a Zizek card against you?
Oh, shit.
Psychoanalytic capitalism.
Oh.
Which also deals with is similar to semiotic capitalism and deals with things like linguistics and the sign economy. Don't advocate traditional Marxist methods for dismantling capitalism, usually a little more considered more radical. Like Zizek has an alternative that I'm very fond of, which is to make exaggerations in the system in order to move it towards its inevitable collapse. Strategies like over-identification. Trump, actually, yeah, that is actually something that Zizek wrote about, is that Trump is a good example of over-identification with the system and having it move it into crisis and collapse, which is pretty much what's happening right now. What is usually the link to psychoanalytic capitalism? Somebody runs Zizek against you. What is it that you did that's the link? Is it something the plan did? What is it? What are they trying to say about what the AF did, usually with psychoanalytic Marxism? Think simply. Usually it's trying to interrogate the intentions behind the AF. Like why you presented this in this first place. What are your desires or motivations in making these types of presentations? There's another one. There's two more. One of them is kind of debatable, which I'm going to get to last, but this one is definitely one that's been in debates. Intersectional capitalism, like racialized capitalism, like black anti-capitalist movements.
Oh, like the black Marxism stuff?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Typically, those usually bar certain aspects of traditional Marxism, but combine it under the lens of some type of particularized identity category, like blackness, like brownness, queerness, disability, etc. Now, what is different from intersectional or racialized capitalism than, let's say, orthodox Marxism? What is the distinction? Yeah.
Orthodox Marxism says that we should have sort of like a sole focus on capital and not sort of like discuss like these sort of racial issues.
Exactly. Why? What is the reason why Orthodox Marxism says that we should only and exclusively focus on class antagonisms?
I was just gonna say, because there's according to Orthodox Marxism, there's two things, I can't remember which is which, but one's the superstructure, one's the base. If you're talking about things like racial issues, that's only affecting the superstructure, but class antagonism lies in the base.
Right. All of those things that exist in the upper part of the structure are considered, ever heard the word obfuscation? It obfuscates true class analysis.
It's like the fracturing.
Yes. It makes it blurry. It confuses the actual causes of capitalism and makes critique less effective. Because the purpose of Marxism, in most of these instances, actually in almost all these instances, is to create a universal movement against capitalism. They all have different methods of getting there. They all have different alternatives. But all of these, except neoliberalism, which is why I said it's not really the KAP-K, are supposed to produce some type of universal struggle against capitalism. Okay, now that you have there's one last form of capitalism that I want to talk about, which is what I like to call the performative or a capitalist critique of debate.
Like the commodification side?
Sort of. It critiques the structure. The links aren't necessarily to the affirmative, but the form or the method in which the affirmative was presented. A lot of times these critiques will masquerade as one of the other types of options of the KAP-K in hoping that you don't answer that level of the critique. I did very well running a version of this critique where people just thought it was just random GJK, when in reality it was actually a pretty on-point criticism of the economy of debate. So a lot of times when you're debating capitalism, you not just have to defend your affirmative, but also the place and manner in which you have presented it. And it's very important during cross-ex to try to isolate and figure out which one of these KAP-Ks they're running against you. Now, what is the best aspect of the critique in order to determine which one this is? Where will you normally the critique tip its hand about which one it is?
The alt.
Exactly, the alternative. The alternative is always going to be the weak point of this critique, and we're going to get to that in just a second. But first, before we do that, what are some tricks that CAP debaters use in debate rounds to kind of get one over on the affirmative?
Root cause arguments.
Root cause arguments is one. They claim that CAP is the root cause of everything. What else?
Unsustainable.
Yep, CAP collapse is inevitable, which is crisis theory. What is crisis theory? Yep.
CAP is going to collapse, but the 1AC sort of like the link debate proves that it sort of reinvigorates it and prevents that collapse from happening.
Sure, that is the argument, but I'm asking why CAP collapse is inevitable. Why, according to the theory of Marxism, does it say that it's inevitable?
Because like the working class inevitably feels dispossessed and need to.
Has to deal with the antagonism we just talked about. Class antagonisms, the fulcrum for collapse is already embedded and essential to the structure of capitalism. That capitalism only sustains itself when it can constantly paper over and kind of minimize the effects of the antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. What else? What was another strategic advantage or one other thing, the reason why we're going over this is because when you're answering the KAP-K, your best arguments against the KAP-K should always be offense against the KAP-K's best arguments. Because I feel like each of these arguments, and we're going to go through them after we kind of talk about them a little bit, on how you can offensively use these tricks to your advantage. Because not only do you undercut their ability to deploy the critique later down the line, but it also avoids you from not answering a portion of the critique. Because a lot of times that's how teams lose these debates, is by conceding one of these or not addressing one of these types of tricks. But what else? What else can they get to do?
The epistemology arguments? I don't know if that
you're close. What does that mean? What do they mean by epistemology? You're getting close to one of the answers. You beat.
Like the literature that the affirmative reads is rooted in like capitalism.
It can, and what I like to call this one is a manipulation of history surrounding events. They try to control the meta-narrative that contextualizes the history surrounding the events that make the 1AC intelligible. So if you talk about sex oppression or race oppression, they try to control the underlying historical narrative that makes those things cohesive in the first place, to essentially get underneath your literature base, to be able to subsume everything with like a sweeping epistemology claim, or claim that your reading of history is invalid, to delegitimize all of the affirmative arguments that you could possibly make. What else?
Like the quantification arguments.
I just think that's just a yeah, that could be one of them, but I'm
It's
looking.
not exclusive to cap, but like,
Right.
I think a lot of caps use the argument that like, what do you call it? Because the app is like interjecting whatever like knowledge that they talk about like into like the information economy, like neoliberal elites can like sort of control the way that that image is viewed. Like,
I feel like commodification arguments are part of what makes a cap K tricky, but a lot of that begs the question of the uniqueness.
Yeah.
Which is usually how I respond to that, and that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later. But when we talk about specifically the alternative, but I'm looking for something else. That's a good answer, but that's not really what I was looking for. Typically, because the cap K controls the root cause to everything, the alternative always tries to solve the AF in some type of respect. Either the direct material effects or the reasons why the AF exists in the first place. Can easily become a floating pick, yeah.
You talked about it a little bit, but I'm not sure what psychoanalytic cap is.
Psychoanalytic capitalism usually uses parts of Marxism and Lacan in order to interrogate the language and discourse surrounding capitalism and how that feeds on human desire. Like the relationship to desire to consume. How that can be concealed in supposed revolutionary acts, even if we're not aware of them. Tries to get into the subconscious or the mind of whoever is speaking and read intentions into what the affirmative is supposed to be about.
So why are those intentions bad?
Because they're usually in a desire for capitalism. That your actual desire to resist capitalism is a secret desire for capitalism. Like, for example, queer movements. Harvey Milk. Anybody ever heard of like the gay rights movement in California? Harvey Milk example is a good example because it was supposedly a resistance towards the inability for gay people to own businesses. And they were trying to fight for economic freedom, and they were fighting against capitalist oppression. But in reality, their desire wasn't to end capitalism. It was just to get a seat at the table so they could be capitalist. And if we just look at the material dimensions of what they're doing, you can miss how a lot of those strategies are actually rooted in a libidinal or a subconscious desire for capitalism.
Oh, speaking of libidinal, I've always just like been confused about what the libidinal economy is.
Libidinal economy is just it's a fancy word for desire. In a psychoanalytic context, it talks specifically about the sexualized nature of desire.
Okay.
But for the purposes of this critique, just think of it as a stand-in for desire. There's one other thing why do you think it is that people run cap in debates? What is something that is unique to that literature base that you might not find in other forms of academic literature? Yeah.
Like links to everything.
That is one of the things that I had down here, is that it links to everything. That is true. CAP does link to everything.
Extinction?
Sure it does. Links to, oh no, not that, I mean it links to that, but no. The thing that I'm looking for is that it has a very unique claim of exclusivity that only this method can solve. only a unique focus on class can solve. Only an intersectional approach to capitalism can solve. They write very good competitive K-alts, which is a lot of times why debaters tend to use them in debates. Because they're very hard to permute. They're very all or nothing. You either dismantle capitalism or you don't, which makes it strategic for debates. Okay, those are the strong parts. What are some of the weak parts? What are some of the ways in which teams typically answer the CAP-K? There are two basic strategies. Yeah. I'm looking for offensive claims. Offense. But yes. What are two basic holistic 2AC strategies you can engage the K with? There are two things you can do.
Decentralizing.
That one of them is a link turn / permutation strategy or an impact turn strategy. Now the reason why particularly for K debaters, the impact turn strategy is not usually an option is because a lot of the reasons why CAP would be good would at the very least create tension with whatever type of criticism that 1AC is engaging in. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the impact turn portion of this lecture. Other than that, when you're making impact turn arguments, just make sure you answer both the root cause and also the cap collapse inevitable tricks. Because if you don't, they could subsume your impact turns. But for permutation / link turn debates, in order to win a permutation of capitalism, you must first prove what?
The alt and the app are not mutually exclusive.
Yes, theoretically, but before you can make a permutation argument, what is another argument you also must win against this K, and why?
Alt can't solve the app.
You must answer that argument, yep. You have to win that the alternative cannot solve the affirmative or that there is some disadvantage to the alternative in order to prefer the permutation. Because most of these CAP critiques, like I said, will try to get underneath your literature base. And unless you can prove a solvency deficit or a disadvantage that only the permutation can resolve, you're going to lose these debates because there's no reason to prefer the permutation when there's a risk of a link. And because, like I said, CAP links to everything, they're always going to win a risk of a link to the perm. Always. Okay. Now we're going to go through some of these tricks and talk about some of the ways in which you can respond to them. First is crisis theory. Some of the major ways that you can answer the crisis theory are, one, is you can just straight up empirically try to disprove the fact that cap collapse is inevitable. You can say cap is sustainable right now. It's going to keep continuing. But what are some performative reasons or some ways you can garner offense against this when they make this claim against you? I want you all to take a moment to think about this. Like when they're making these types of claims like cap collapse is inevitable. We have to try or die for cap. What does this sound like when someone makes this type of calculus? Even if our alternative isn't that great, cap collapse is happening now, so we got no other choice. We have to make transitions now. We're all going to go extinct.
Sounds like an impact factor.
Yeah, but what about that impact calculus is that sound similar to? They're making a type of impact calculus that they're what?
No, the magnitude is...
They're criticizing that type of coercive analysis, saying that we should prefer some type of imperfect strategy because we're in a desperate situation. That sounds like the status quo. That sounds like the reason for why we should do the AF, even though it's not perfect, because we're risking extinction right now. If anything, that is a form of capitalism. That type of coercion, that type of individualistic desire to survive. Because if it's about transitioning, it's about ethics, why does this matter? So the words they say matters. So a lot of times people will engage in the same types of capitalist logic that they're criticizing. What's a way that you could turn it links to everything? This one's easy. What happens in a lot of cap debates? You see like these cap framework debates against race teams. What is one of the first arguments they always make?
Cap's the root cause.
No, not the negative team, the affirmative team. What is one of the first things the 2AC says and stands up when they're responding to that type of strategy?
Is it the K links framework? Or
Yeah.
framework links
Yeah.
The critique is most likely going to link to other things in the debate. Or to themselves. So use that against them. The root cause debate. How is this one way you can use this against them?
I mean, just like root cause is impact around it, like root cause bad or root cause analysis bad.
You could, but a lot of times, like I said, you're also claiming a root cause in your app. We're assuming like a situation where you have some type of critical affirmative, yeah.
Do it only the app solves.
You should be making that claim. I'm looking for offense. I'm looking for a reason why this hurts them. Not just a reason why it isn't true. If you're also running some type of totalizing criticism, some type of critique that says, you know, we must understand social phenomena through the lens of anti-blackness, that means their desire to reduce everything down to class is probably a reason why that should be rejected.
I don't get that.
It's really reductionist, I guess.
Yes, it's reductionist, and it also doesn't solve. That's a reason why it doesn't solve the AF, and the AF is now disadvantaged to their alternative. And you should frame it as such. Like if your affirmative is making a criticism, like we need to focus on racial antagonisms, and they try to paper over the complexity and the necessity of dealing with those antagonisms by trying to skirt the discussion and center it around capitalism, that's probably bad. Can someone give me a reason, based on the way these arguments deploy to debate, why that, an in-round example of why that's problematic? Something that the debate community does over and over again, at least from my perspective, from some of the teams that I coach. How many people out there are running orthodox Marxism AFs? How many people are running around running cap on the AF and the NEG these days? Last night somebody told me there was a Dartmouth team that does it. Matt, do you know anybody else that's like running cap on the AF and the NEG like every round?
No.
Yeah, so there you go. These examples don't exist. Why is it that whenever someone wants to talk about a subject that makes white people feel uncomfortable, that their answer is Orthodox Marxism? We can only talk about class. Sorry, I would love to talk about this stuff, but gotta talk about class. Don't you think that's a little problematic? It seems disingenuous at best, especially when they're making these radical claims to exclusivity and rejection. Which is where I get to my next way in which you should answer the alternative, which is making a distinction between the performative and the hypothetical. Most of the time when you're in debates, they'll say things, we should endorse a method of historical materialism. We should endorse a method of radical rejection. We should endorse a grassroots movement of a coalition between black, white, and brown bodies in order to dismantle capitalism. How many people actually do that historical materialism? Where's the history report? Where's the book? Where's the treatise that gives a detailed historical takedown of what the 1AC just did? Where is it?
Non-existent.
A lot of times, typically, if you're using your affirmative properly, if it's critical, there's a performative dimension to the affirmative. And you should leverage the performativity of the 1AC against the hypothetical endorsement of the alternative. It's not what you should do, it's what you do that matters. The alternative is just a suggestion. We should engage in this instead of what the 1AC did. But the 1AC actually does something. The 1AC is a process, a performance of critique, or whatever. Does everybody understand that distinction between performativity? And that's also a huge reason in which you should be framing the permutation. You should be framing through the permutation through the lens of performativity. A lot of times teams like me do this. That's why a lot of teams claim like survival strategies or necessity as a justification for why they do the 1AC in face of capitalism. Because that is impacting out the performative benefits of what they had done in the 1AC and making a differential between that and the alternative to solve it. A lot of things that I like to do is look, I actually just call the alternatives a historical book report. Like, how does an historical book report deal with the anxieties that debaters of color deal with when they walk into a debate space? I don't know. Like, maybe one of you could tell me. You think reading a history book before, you step into a debate that isn't about debate, a book report that isn't about debate, would that be helpful? I don't know. I'm a white guy. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah. If it is, let me know. Then maybe, you might want to try your hand at running like a cat cave. But from my understanding is that typically, you want something more than just like we should do something. That isn't a reason why you should reject the affirmative. Even if your hypothetical is true, it's not responsive to the whole purpose and point of the affirmative. But okay. Did we go over that? Let's talk about the uniqueness debate. I think that you should always be making arguments about the uniqueness of the link in every CAP debate. I don't know. I may be wrong about this, but I always think, first of all, how do critiques generate uniqueness? This is a basic refresher. This is like debate 101. The alternative. A lot of times in debates, when they try to clarify or specify the link, they'll have a hard time creating a specific justification for why the alternative solves the link. Just as a debate thing, what must every link for me must always contain a warrant inside of it why the alternative resolves it in order for it to be a persuasive reason why it rejects the 1AC. So if you see there are links that are incomplete with analysis, like a lot of times they'll be like universal rejection. But how does universal rejection solve for the particular instance of the AF? In debate. You need to push them on a lot of these questions. Because it links to everything and their alternatives tend to be hyper generic, it's very hard for a negative to articulate substantial and robust explanations of how the alternative solves the specific link. And that gives the affirmative an opening in which to explain how the permutation resolves it. Because if you can beat them to the punch of that internal link, you then control the direction of that link. Remember, not all links are non-unique without an alternative. So if you short circuit the internal link from the link to the alternative, you own that link.
Real quick.
Yep.
For the link uniqueness argument, do you think like a good argument to make is that like regardless of the app, there's still like sort of race-based movements like Black Lives Matter and stuff, which probably means that regardless of the app, like the alt can't solve anyways, because there's other things that are like against those alternatives that are just like the fracturing arguments, right?
Yeah.
So do you think it's strategic to be like there's obviously like sort of race-based things are always going to be inevitable, so doesn't that mean fracturing is inevitable? It means that the alt can't solve.
Yeah, and I would be like, how is the affirmative's performance in this different than that?
Yeah.
Like, why aren't you like out on the street like challenging Black Lives Matter protesters? I'm like, oh, probably because that would be really racist. Yeah. Which is probably a reason why what you're doing in this debate is also equally racist. That's another thing. Gut check arguments I also think are persuasive against Cap case. A lot of times there are internal inconsistencies. Like the other day, I know you've all seen the movie Resolved.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I knew you were going to watch it today, and there was something in the Resolved movie that, hold on a second. Okay. In the Resolved movie, one of the arguments they made against one of the race performance teams in that movie was that there was a tension between their desire for revolution and their desire to change debate and also participate in it. That same tension exists with every CapK. For me, I'm always left scratching my head at the end of a lot of Cap debates as to how the Cap critique escapes those own competitive motivations that exist inherent to the structure of debate. Which is why I said that, performance or the debate CapK is usually my favorite form of the CapK, to be honest. It's the one that I ran quite a bit when I was in college. Because it dealt with that issue head on. Now, Zizek has a way of getting out of that. There's the whole over-identification concept that Zizek presents, which was my argument, was that we participate in the debate through a process of over-identification with the horrible structures of debate. What do you do if someone does something like that? How would you answer that? If someone who's like, debate is inherently capitalist, even if your app is good in the abstract, you participate in a system of capitalist exploitation. Your coaches must hire people, exploit the labor of people like Matt Struth in order to make debate possible. They must buy plane tickets. They must buy food from service workers that don't get health insurance. How do you resolve that? Yeah. So does the NEG.
Yeah.
But my argument is like, so what? We're at least being honest. We're like, yep, we do that, and that's good. Doing bad stuff is good, impact term. But you lie about it. That's the differential. So that's why you should lose. You pretend like what you do here is beneficial. How would you answer that?
Say that you're doing that too.
Right, and that's our argument.
Yeah.
That is the argument. Yes, we admit that. We stand up in the 1NC and we're like, yep, we are monsters. We do horrible things.
What does admitting that do?
The difference is at least we are honest about it.
Oh, so you're saying the negative.
It's net worse to try to be. Zizek has a claim that says it is not passivity or the non-desire to act that leads to capitalism. It is pseudo-activity or pseudo-activism. Pseudo-liberal garbage is what he calls it.
Yeah. That's like the argument that we pretend like we're doing something when in reality we're not, right?
Right.
Okay.
Sort of like, the elevator in the dorm, how the bottom button doesn't work?
Yeah.
Zizek has this thing where it's like, he says pseudo-activity or liberalism is constantly pressing the button to the elevator and thinking that it'll move faster. Come on, reform, come on! When in reality, it's never going to come. It's never going to come any faster, and most likely that button is broken and the elevator ain't coming at all. So again, how would you respond to that?
So the alternative is just to accept the inevitability of those structures?
Yes, that's the whole crisis theory thing, about how cap collapse is inevitable now. We should exaggerate the system and have it come crashing to the ground. So we should go out there and be the most horrible, monstrous, horrific capitalist that we can possibly be.
And if you're a race team, you can say it's pretty white.
Yeah, exactly. It's hella privileged to be able to say things like that. And that's what I was talking about, the gut check argument. If they want to play this game of exaggeration, now, you have to walk a fine line here. That doesn't mean have an escalating arm race to where physical violence actually occurs in a debate round. So you want to be careful that is not what I'm explicitly not telling you to do these things. Because I definitely had students who have taken this advice the wrong way and have gotten into...
No, they
didn't get into a fight. They just said horribly disrespectful things to another team.
Oh, sure.
And I wasn't coaching them at the time. Basically, a student who I had coached took the argument that I had coached him on and then tried to teach it to other kids without telling me when I told him explicitly that he wasn't allowed to do that. For that very reason, because I knew that was a possibility and didn't give them that advice, and they did something pretty messed up in a debate round.
What they do?
Oh, they cursed at another team in a high school debate round. And the funny part was I was judging the debate, which was the worst part about it. They're reading my blocks and stuff, and I was just like, wait a minute, I definitely didn't give you this stuff. Where did you get this? But anyways, don't want to get sidetracked because we're running out of time.
Vote them down.
Oh, of course I did. Of course I voted them down. Not only that, but I shamed them for about 30 minutes in my RFD. But the point is that in those instances where they make those types of arguments, you need to reveal that what they're actually advocating for is probably so horrific that it is something that the judge will not be able to vote for. So you need to be able to get them to clarify or explain, because they'll just defend an abstract concept of over-identification or cloak it in words. But what does that actually mean when you actualize those types of performances? That would justify like a KKK member standing up, putting on a hood, and then going on a racist rant against a person of color in the room. Is that really what you're endorsing? Is that really what you think the most effective strategy is? Also, a lot of times, the argument is making an argument as to why debate itself is bankrupt. Every person who's in the back of the room who's judging debates has spent their entire lives and careers in the activity, believing in its benefit. So the other team is already at a disadvantage, just based on the condition that the person in the back of the room is a believer already in your argument. So they're already on your side. They're already more willing to believe that there is some redeeming aspect of debate. And that's all you need to prove. You don't need to justify all of capitalism. That's the next part of this argument, the next part of this answer. You just need to justify a particular instance of it. You don't have to justify, like, exploitation of the third world. You just need to justify what the affirmative did in this particular instance, in this particular round, was justified. And that thing always should be framed as a disadvantage to the alternative, whatever that is. Something the alternative cannot resolve, that only the permutation can resolve. Because like I said, it's going to link to everything. They're always going to win a risk of a link. You need a reason why you prefer the permutation. Okay, we have like 5 minutes left, and I got through everything on my checklist that I wanted to discuss. Does anybody have any questions? You can even ask me like a theoretical question about one of these schools of Marxism. I can even talk about that. Doesn't even have to be about the strategies that we had talked about.
Wait, so is black Marxism saying cap good as black people own the means of production, or?
Not necessarily. It's more of like we need an intersectional lens in order to interrogate and understand Marxism.
Okay.
Not understand Marxism, understand class oppression.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you read a cap case against a team and they're like, well, cap is inevitable, so we should do it either way, how would you answer that?
If cap is inevitable, how would I answer that?
Yeah.
So you're saying that the negative is saying cap is, the affirmative is saying cap is inevitable? As a negative debater, how would I answer that? Oh, I would be like, one, that's not true, and I would definitely disagree with the empirical claim that cap is inevitable. And two, I would probably say capitalism is only inevitable because capitalism teaches you so. That's the whole totalizing, can get underneath your claims epistemology argument, magic tricks they can do. They can just be like, oh, that's just because you haven't thought about critically about capitalism. And the way that you answer that is with one of the arguments that I described above, about how that type of totalizing nature of capitalism is exactly the reason why your stuff is methodologically bankrupt.
How do you win the meta-narrative debate? Like, they're controlling the empirics stuff.
The empirics example, usually a lot of the empirical reasons why cap is sustainable right now. Like, for example, one thing that I genuinely believe is that capitalism is very good at sustaining itself. It knows how to innovate like crazy. And that typically, a lot of times that I would say is that when crisis happens, like what crisis theory assumes a principle of scarcity, one of the reasons why I think capitalism in general is sustainable almost indefinitely is because capitalism can create artificial markets. You can think of it this way, like electronic markets that exist like only purely on the internet. These things don't correspond, like things like Facebook and Twitter don't correspond to any type of physical resource limit. So the potential ability to develop markets is almost endless. So a lot of like the theoretical limits of capitalism that Marx described are no longer true. They're just not. Bitcoin is a great example of this. They can just, like the market can create its own alternative currency
So you think it's probably true that physical capitalism, well, eventually we'll run out of coal or whatever,
Mhm.
but capitalism will never die.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, that's just me. That's just based on my 29 years of existence and what I've read. I found that argument the most persuasive.
Okay. So if like an app argued that because of those instances, would that be like an inevitability argument the app should be making? Because it seems kind of defensive.
Well, I think I think that you want to make defensive arguments. It depends. I think that depends on the affirmative you're running. If you can justify, if you're going for sort of like capitalism can be good in certain instances, it might be acceptable to make arguments like capitalism will always exist. And if capitalism is always going to exist, then that means we need to develop strategies in which to make capitalism better.
So,
I.e. what the affirmative did,
So
using
what if-
capitalism in a good way.
what if you, instead of saying cap good, you're going for sort of, like for example, like Baudrillard, like nihilism is
Mhm.
good and we shouldn't attach a meaning to things, and that we need to develop more ethical ways. I guess ethics is probably not the right word to use.
No, but I understand what you're saying, yeah.
More ethical ways of existing within those structures or navigating them
Mhm.
because they are inevitable.
Mhm.
Would you say that those examples should be good to win the sort of inevitability debate
Mhm.
and like the value of life argument?
Yep.
Okay.
I do.
Quick question. I haven't run into it myself, but like, do you know about like the accelerating cap arguments?
Mhm.
Could you go over? Because I know someone said they read a case that's the only way to stop cap is to accelerate it into destruction.
Yeah, that's kind of like the over-identification argument I was just describing. Is that's the point, is that capitalism internal to its own system already has the blueprints for its own demise.
Yeah.
Because it is only when capitalism pushes itself towards crisis that it can revolutionize itself. Not revolutionize capitalism, like get rid of it, meaning that change capitalism itself, shift the deck chairs on the ship in order to make it more palatable to people that live underneath it. I.e., American currency collapses and Bitcoin becomes a new thing that everyone trades with internationally. It's just a means at which to justify more capitalism.
Did Zizek say he would have voted for Trump?
Yep, he did say that. He said the reason why he would have voted for Trump is because Hillary Clinton is the pseudo-activist, the pseudo-liberal, who we don't know is actually in it with us or against us, and is that obfuscation that is problematic. He's just like, at least Donald Trump, I know he's an evil man, and I know what he's going to do, and I know what he's doing is going to be bad.
But he likes the bad things because it will accelerate the collapse of capitalism.
Yeah. He doesn't say that deliberately because that would make him seem like a really terrible person, which he is, and he would say it's probably good. Zizek is hella contradictory. So, he says a lot of competing and exclusive things about his own beliefs in these subjects. But, yeah. That was basically his argument. His argument is basically that, has anybody... Okay, there is an amazing set of books. It's by this... I think it's this Portuguese author. The first book is called Blindness. Has anyone ever read it? Okay, you should. It's one of the most amazing pieces of fiction that I've ever read. It is a book without punctuation, and it is supposed to simulate the condition of blindness in the reader, so you don't know which character is speaking. So it's very internally disorienting. It's a fun thing to read if you're over the summer and have some time. It's a great story.
Oh, isn't that Saramago? That's his name?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And in his book on violence, he uses an example from the second book, which is called The Seeing, which is after all of society gains all their vision back, and they create a new democratic society. And what he says is disruptive to the system, this new democratic system, is basically they hold these elections. And people go to the elections and they submit blank ballots. And the system is just like, oh, geez, what happened? People must have got the wrong information, or they got confused, or it was raining that day. Something weird, some anomaly happened, and that's why most of these ballots are blank. So they call a new election, and the voter turnout is double what it was during the first election. But all the ballots are still blank. System doesn't know what to do at this point. System starts freaking out, thinking that there's some revolution afoot, starts cracking down on people, martial law, throwing people in prison, public executions on the streets, so on and so forth. The point is that Zizek says is that sometimes these acts of passivity, not doing things, like submitting blank ballots to the ballot box, can be way more disruptive to the system than outright resistance. Because the system doesn't know what to do. And the system then reveals itself for what it truly is, which is just a license to commit violence against its people. Because that monster, that ability to crack down and kill huge swaths of the population at will, always existed, even before those ballots were submitted. But at least now, the system has revealed itself for what it is. And we all can universally then say that this is bad. We know that that is monstrous. We know universally as a society that that is something that needs to be resisted. Whereas before, there's some people like, it's not that bad. I get health care, and I have a job that pays me, not really enough to eat, but, at least I'm not, homeless. It gets everyone on the same page, which is why I said that all these critiques are always about, like, a universal rejection of capitalism in some degree. Except neoliberalism, which I said isn't really a CAPK. Any other questions? I like talking about this stuff. I wish I had more than an hour to sit here and talk about this stuff, but I just wanted to give you the quick rundown of like all of the basic types of tricks that caps had and just some basic strategies for how to make sure you use those as offense. So just to recap, the performativity versus hypothetical. It's not what you should do, it's what you do. Their best arguments should be your best arguments in these debates.
Yeah.
So the things that makes caps most strategic are the things where you want to put your offense. And if you have any questions after that, I'll be willing to answer them another time. All right? Thank you. Lunchtime.